We begin by honoring John Lewis, who has died at the age of 80 after battling pancreatic cancer. This is the scene this morning at the John Lewis mural turned memorial in Atlanta. And in Washington, the flag over the Capitol flying at half-staff. Lewis was a towering figure in the fight for civil rights, a moral compass whose message and life's work has left an indelible mark on our nation. He worked alongside Martin Luther King Jr., chaired the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. In Selma, he was beaten at the hands of a state trooper on what's known as Bloody Sunday. And he was the last surviving speaker to address the March on Washington in 1963. But his legacy will live on, his voice amplified as America reckons with racism. One of his last public appearances just last month, visiting the Black Lives Matter mural steps from the White House, the site of so many protests amid an ongoing, massive movement for racial equality. His message in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing: just as people of all faiths and no faiths and all backgrounds, creeds and colors banded together decades ago to fight for equality and justice in a peaceful, orderly, nonviolent fashion, we must do so again. Representatives Karen Bass, chair of Congressional Black Caucus, and Val Demings, longtime colleagues of John Lewis, join me now with more. And Congresswoman Bass, I'd like to start with you. As soon as you heard the news, you tweeted a clip of an event you did 2 years ago with Congressman Lewis, where he talked about how he wants to be remembered. Let's listen.
What do you see as your legacy?
I said to young people and people not so young, I just tried to help out. Just tried to help out.
Just tried to help out. It's such an incredible example of his humility. Tell us what else his legacy means to you.
Oh, well, you know, one of the greatest honors of serving in Congress was that I had the possibility of serving with him. And I think his legacy to our country is that he devoted his life to fighting for justice and being a moral compass. You know, I think one of the best ways that we could honor him is to make sure that the Voting Rights Act passed, that is sitting over in the Senate and has been there for over 200 days. So I think that he just taught us so many lessons in that regard, and he's going to be so sorely missed. That day, he was at an organization that I started. I wanted him to meet 2 generations of young people that he influenced, and I wanted them to have an opportunity to tell him what he meant to them. So it was a memorable day for me.
I'm sure it was. You have also spoken about how he insisted that you just call him John, not Mr. Lewis or Congressman Lewis. Can you tell us more about his personality, his levity, and how you saw it shape his work?
Absolutely. You know, he's such a calm figure, but a calm figure that was rock solid. And so, yes, he said to me, Karen, would you please just call me John? And I said, no, Mr. Lewis, I'm never going to call you John. You are just an icon. The nation lost an icon. The House lost the most respected member of the House of Representatives. And the Congressional Black Caucus lost a member of our family.
I do want to ask you about one of your tweets. You called on President Trump to stay silent about Lewis's death, saying, please say nothing, please don't comment. Hours later, President Trump did tweet condolences for Lewis and his family, but it's no secret that John Lewis and Trump had an adversarial relationship. What's your hope for how the congressman will be honored in this time of political and racial division?
Well, I know he will be honored properly, again, because he was the most respected member of the House, respected by the Senate, respected by both parties. I remember one time when one of my Republican colleagues put an amendment forward that was going to cut money for voting rights enforcement. And Mr. Lewis was in his office, heard about it, ran on the floor, gave a speech. That Republican member publicly apologized and withdrew his amendment. My concern, and I'm glad that the president's tweet was appropriate after mine, but I think that we need to have the flags at half-mast until he is laid to rest. And I believe that his legacy will live on. Now, all of us, what we have to do is live up to his legacy. We need to continue that fight for social justice. And again, the first thing we need to do is to pass the Voting Rights Act and get it signed, because we're very concerned about the election coming up and voter suppression, and the fact that people are going to have to vote in dangerous conditions. They need to be able to vote from home. And I know that if he was still with us, he would be leading that fight.
And thanks so much for that. And Congressman Demings, I want to turn to you. You shared some very touching tweets about your time in Congress on Twitter, but I'd like to ask you about what his work meant to you before that. Of course, another civil rights leader died this week as well, Reverend C.T. Vivian. You grew up in the segregated South in the 60s in segregated schools. You were really quite young on Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965, when Lewis was among the civil rights leaders who marched from Montgomery to Selma, Alabama. But what's your first memory of hearing about him, understanding what he was standing up for?
Well, Martha, first of all, let me express my condolences again to his family and really, quite frankly, to our nation, because it really feels like a part of America died on Friday. John Lewis was larger than life. I don't think I've ever really met anybody like him. I was in awe of him as a young child growing up in the 60s. My parents were very tuned in, but I was also in awe of him until the day he died. He was powerful. He was larger than life. He was beloved. But the thing I remember so much about him is that he was so humble. And I was just listening to Chairwoman Bass describe him. I too had those encounters with Mr. John Lewis, where every time I saw him on the floor, I would go up to him and say, "Hello, Mr. John Lewis." And he would say, "Well, hello, young lady." That part I really appreciated. But he'd say, "Hello, young lady, please call me John." And I would say, "Okay, Mr. John Lewis." He just made everybody feel like they were the only person in the room that mattered. I had an opportunity to go on one of the Faith and Politics trips with him. I took my niece, and I remember him spending time with my niece like she was the only person in the room, but walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge with John Lewis. And I remember getting to the other side, and especially as a former law enforcement officer, and thinking about Bloody Sunday and how that day John Lewis and others were basically tortured and beaten. But on this Sunday, we walked across and the troopers were there, very diverse group of troopers, I might add, were there to welcome us and to make sure that we were okay. And so that is a direct result, Martha, because of John Lewis dedicating his life to social justice and righting wrongs and making sure that we see more first in this country. And we owe him a debt of gratitude. It will never be the same in the House of Representatives without John Lewis. And
But his influence remains, and I just want to go back to that. One of his last public images was on the Black Lives Matter mural here in Washington, D.C. How do you think his legacy will impact how history will see the current push for equality? What would you tell young people?
John Lewis loved the young protesters. And, demonstrated by his actions, he would always stop and take time to interact with them wherever they were and wherever he was. And so his legacy, he sees it demonstrated every day in the protesters who are out there in all 50 states. John Lewis has left us a great roadmap. And if we can continue to be half of the servants fighting for social justice that John Lewis was, then we're going to be okay. We have to continue to fight and finish the work, the amazing work that Mr. John Lewis started in this country.
Thank you so much, Representative Demings and Representative Bass. We really appreciate your time this morning and those wonderful memories.